Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the seminar series organized by the Empathic Computing Laboratory. I'm your host, Aladdin, and our guest speaker for today is Geoff Kaufman, who is currently an associate professor of social computing at CMU. His research interests are in persuasive technologies, including games, storytelling platform. He has done lots of great work in its AI community and empathy since 2004, if that's correct. The title of the talk is Games and Fictional Worlds as Empathy Building Spaces. The talk will be roughly an hour, followed by brief questions and answers. Thank you, Geoff, for joining us.
Sure. Thank you, Aladdin. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for organizing this talk. It's really great to be with you all today or tonight here. It's just past 9 p.m. here in Pittsburgh. We had a very wintry day. I was telling Aladdin earlier, a very unusually wintry day with snow and sleet and wind, even though we're a month into spring here. Let me go ahead and share my slides and let me know if you have any issues seeing them.
Yep, it's all good here.
Great. All right, I'll go ahead and get started. I'll do a brief introduction. Some of this will repeat some of the information that Aladdin shared about me and my work. But essentially, I run a research lab here at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh that we call the eHeart Lab. Here's one snapshot of my lab on a sunnier day here at the university. But overall, our lab focuses on designing persuasive technologies. My training is as a social psychologist, so a lot of the work that I do is in the domain of applied psychology, taking psychological theory and principles and strategies and using them to inform the design of transformational technologies. And the bulk of the work that I do is in the space of designing games or storytelling platforms or what we consider to be playful computer-mediated interactions and evaluating their impact on individuals' behaviors, emotions, self-concepts, and so forth. More recently, we've also started to explore the role of technology, specifically in affecting the lives of members of marginalized populations. So that work, in some cases, has involved designing technologies to support or empower members of marginalized groups, including the design of games and storytelling platforms for marginalized groups, for example, racial minority members, LGBTQ+ individuals, and so forth. But also understanding how sometimes technology can exacerbate issues of marginalization or prejudice, understanding how technology can sometimes reinforce social biases and stereotypes. In addition, we have a strict ethos of inclusion and in our research process, but also in the culture of the lab that we cultivate together. And in general, I didn't mention, but eHeart is a fairly clumsy acronym that stands for Enhancing Human Experiences, Attitudes, and Relationships through Technology, which is a bit of a misnomer in that some of the work that we do doesn't involve technology at all. In fact, some of the projects I'll mention today are strictly non-digital. For example, the design of board games or the study of text-based narratives that don't have a digital component. But I'll talk about projects in both domains, both digital and non-digital. Here's a sampling of some of the recent papers that my students and collaborators and I have worked on. So for example, we've looked at building theory in relation to games and narratives. The talk today will be centered on this concept of experience taking. That was the topic of my dissertation in psychology and has been sort of a through line for a lot of the work that I do now in games and narratives. But we've also looked at designing other forms of social computing technologies like chatbots, for example, that aim to promote more civil and interactions and to reduce bias and promote empathy in online communities, using fiction as a design tool, for example, using fictional narratives to provide a safe space to talk about experiences with racism. We've done a bit of work in understanding different ways of building empathy as well. So in one project we've looked at, and I think this is tied quite nicely to the work that you do in the Empathic Computing Lab, we've looked at the effect of shared biosignals on building empathy between individuals in an online space, how biosignals like heart rate or brain activity might serve as signals of one's core humanity. And if you introduce those into online interactions, that might be a way to bridge the gap between individuals in those spaces. In addition, some of the work that I do involves formulating frameworks or models for designing persuasive interactions. So the talk today will also focus on one of those models, the embedded design approach that we use, which, as I'll explain, introduces strategies of ways of interweaving or integrating persuasive content, persuasive messaging, and so forth into the design of interactions or experiences in somewhat subtle, in some cases stealthy ways, in ways that counteract, for example, some level of threat or resistance, and make an interaction feel less like an intervention overall. So to start things off, I figured we'd do something interactive. It will also serve to introduce my work to some extent. So this is a game that my colleagues and I worked on a few years ago called Buffalo, which eventually became the commercial product. But this is a card game. As I mentioned earlier, we do a lot of non-digital projects. This is a card game that's meant to be played in large groups. And the rules are fairly simple. There are 2 decks of cards in the game. One deck will have words that are nouns on them. The other deck will have words that are adjectives on them. And as a group, you draw 1 card from each deck at a time, and you try to be the first person to name somebody who fits that pair of descriptors. So for example, if you drew nerdy athlete or female scientist, you want to be the first person to identify an individual who fits that pair of descriptors. And the person can be fictional, it can be real, someone who is historical or currently living, somebody who's famous or not so famous, somebody local, someone even within your own group. You can even identify yourself in some cases if you fit those descriptions, but your goal is to be the quickest to identify somebody who fits those descriptors. So I prepared a few slides just to show you how the game works. So I think for purposes of our time together, maybe you can use the chat. So on each slide, I'll present a pair of words on cards, just like in the game. And if you can think of somebody who fits those pair of descriptors, type that person's name into the chat. All right. I think I have 5 or 6 of these ready to go. And as a forewarning, they're meant to be, some of them are meant to be a bit challenging or tricky. The whole point of the game, one of the meanings of the word buffalo is to stump or to baffle. So these are meant to be somewhat challenging, but they're meant to show your knowledge of historical figures or pop culture figures or just individuals in general. And so we'll go through a few of these slides. If you can think of somebody who fits the descriptors on the screen, feel free to type them into the chat. All right, first example. Who could name a Mexican artist? Can you Google? You can Google after the fact. We've had a lot of cases where people who couldn't think of an example of somebody would then Google answers to use if those pairs came up again. Yeah, I see Frida Kahlo's coming up a lot. That's exactly who I thought of when I put these together. So I have some examples in case we can't think of answers. Yeah, so Frida Kahlo is probably the prototypical example of a Mexican artist. Very good. All right, next example, a Buddhist superstar. Yes, Buddha would absolutely qualify. Good. Any other examples of a Buddhist superstar? Oh, Steve Jobs. I didn't realize he was Buddhist, although maybe I should have known that. Awesome. The example I thought of for this, Sean Penn, another good example. Yeah, awesome. You're doing much better. I tried this out with a group recently, and they were stumped very easily, but you're doing excellent. I thought of Michelle Yeoh, who's one of my favorite actors, who also is Buddhist, and from becoming more and more of an international superstar. All right, next example, a tattooed genius. Yeah, musicians, Travis Barker, Amy Winehouse. Yeah, good, good, good. And for this one, I went into, so Daniel Ricciardo, I'm not sure who that is. Who's Daniel Ricciardo, Tim? Ah, cool, thank you. Yeah, so we have athletes, musicians. For this one, I went back into the history banks. Yeah, I might explain it, the cultural gap of knowledge. And actually, that sort of points out one of the goals of the game is to increase your exposure and knowledge about people you wouldn't have known before. So then once you leave the game, your memory bank is filled with these examples of people that might fit descriptions that you weren't aware of. For this one, I discovered that Thomas Edison, in fact, had a small tattoo of one of his inventions, something I didn't realize. So there you go. Maybe an unexpected nugget of trivia for you as well. do a few more of these, and then I'll explain sort of some of the background of what this game is actually all about. Can you think of an inventive Olympian? This might have been easier a few months ago when the Winter Olympics were happening. Yes. Yeah, I was actually thinking of it. There's a figure skater from France who's a pioneer doing a backflip in competition a few years ago. And this is my thought of Eileen Gu. I'm not sure if Fosbury is either, so I'm learning a lot today. What sport? A Fosbury flop. Is that related to the backflip, or is that something different? Oh, cool. Thank you. Oh, awesome. Very cool. Yeah, I'm learning a lot. Thank you. I'll do a couple more of these. How about a multiracial superhero? Yeah, Naomi Osaka. Good example. Loki, absolutely. So the game is actually, a lot of the words are meant to have multiple meanings. You can construe them as you wish to justify an answer. So Loki, absolutely. For this one, I thought about Miles Morales, who's a super popular example from the Spider-Man films, putting it to the Spider-Verse. And one more. How about a deaf fictional character? Daredevil. Very cool. I thought of Connie from The Walking Dead. Also, if you've seen the recent Academy Award-winning movie Coda, there are a number of deaf characters in there. Although the problem becomes, as we saw some examples of here, the game technically, the rules specify that you have to know the name of the person. So even in the case of Coda, which I saw just recently, I don't remember the names of any of the characters. I can just describe them as say the mother, the father, or the brother. So it becomes sort of an issue in those cases. But of course, the group can define whether or not an answer is acceptable or not. Great. So that's Buffalo. That's the way the game works in practice. If you're playing and you get stumped, typically you would draw more examples of cards. You might have a whole set of cards out on the table and you can sort of mix and match any of the cards as you wish. But this game was designed as part of a project that I worked on as a postdoc a few years ago before joining the faculty at Carnegie Mellon. And the game itself, maybe I'll ask you first what you think the purpose of the game is. So there's definitely, and along with most of my projects, there's some intention, some persuasive intention behind this, some transformational goal behind the game. Can you think of what that might be based on the examples that we saw here? And for this, you can either type into the chat or unmute if you want to contribute. Any ideas of what this game might be doing? Okay, so we have one idea. This might be sort of test of general knowledge or quizzing your knowledge of people. That's definitely true. That's part of what the game is doing, or the ostensible purpose of the game. Yeah, but Tim is hitting on what the actual underlying goal of the game is, to start to identify and surface stereotypes. So it might be cases, for example, where if there are examples of combinations of words that are counter stereotypical, that don't fit your stereotype of a group, or don't fit the norm of a group, is it harder to come up with examples? Often at times it is. And so it reveals how stereotypes affect your knowledge or affect the way you think about specific social categories. And by playing in groups, and ideally in ones in which you'll come up with examples, even if they are difficult to summon, just having those examples in mind is a first step toward counteracting those stereotypes. We start to realize at a sort of metacognitive level how our brain stores information about specific groups and how those representations can often be quite limited. And so if you've heard of the implicit association test, for example, that's a common sort of online tool that's free and accessible. That is probably the most common way of assessing biased associations or biased representations that we have of social categories like race, or gender, nationality, religion, and so forth. And so this game is meant to be sort of a gamified version of that to some extent, because based on how quickly you can respond, you're given some insight about the extent to which you might harbor or hold some unconscious stereotypes towards specific social categories, not because you believe them to be true necessarily, but because of the information that you've been exposed to through popular culture or through socialization. And so at its heart, this game is meant to challenge and hopefully start to counteract stereotypical views or depictions or representations of social categories. We've done some research on the game and found that even after a single game session, in which the decks are stacked such that we design the game in ways that will increase your likelihood of seeing counter stereotypical pairings. But we found that even after a single play session, that we start to see some reversal in players' endorsement of social stereotypes. And at the very least, a growing reluctance to use social categories to form presumptions about somebody. So after playing the game, for example, individuals are less likely to say that you can form a valid conclusion about somebody based on a surface characteristic like their gender. So you can't infer things like someone's personality, for example, or their intelligence level, or their interests based only on those categories. And in fact, you should be motivated to form a more individuated impression of somebody and not rely on those social categories to form those judgments, or to at least question them when they come to mind. Yeah, the game was commercially available. I think it still is technically. It was quite popular for a very brief period when it first came out around 2014, 2015. I believe it's still available in some websites. I'm not sure how available internationally it is. We're currently working on creating a digital version of the game, so that might be a more viable option. But there were sites like Amazon that did sell the game for a while. I could see if I could find other sources for you. The last time I was in a bookstore called Barnes & Noble, I'm not sure if you have that there, but the last time I saw the game in a store, it was in the bargain bin, showing that it had some popularity, but it sort of waned by that point. But it's definitely still available. We still support the game. We think it's a nice tool to sort of start the conversation about bias and prejudice. And so in a nutshell, Buffalo is a nice prototypical example of this broader framework that my colleagues and I use in designing persuasive interventions that we call the embedded design approach. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a broad framework that talks about ways of interweaving, or at the very least, reducing individuals' attention on the intended persuasive goal. And we've used these most often in the space of designing games and narrative-based interventions, but they could have applicability and use outside of games and stories as well. And the rationale for using these more embedded approaches, so using more subtle techniques, not revealing the true purpose of an intervention, at least until partway through or after the experience, is that it has a number of benefits. And so in the high level, these approaches are meant to counteract any sort of defensiveness or threat that might come into play when someone might realize that they're actually experiencing an intervention. And so it's meant to make an intervention itself not feel like an intervention. And so our work has shown this has a number of benefits. So using a more embedded approach, as opposed to a more explicit or overt approach or heavy-handed approach to persuasion, can have a number of distinct benefits. For example, it's more likely to encourage people to take on new perspectives or new roles that they might not otherwise consider, to confront or consider new information that they might not have considered before. And more generally, to feel safer confronting things about themselves or the world around them that might otherwise be uncomfortable or threatening. And I think this is where games and stories are especially powerful. They're really great mechanisms for introducing people to new ideas or new ways of thinking, either about themselves or about other people or about societal issues. Because essentially entering into the world of a game or the world of a fictional narrative creates this sort of safe space in which you might encounter that information. And we've explored a number of distinct embedded design strategies. I won't go through all of them today. I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. But I will just mention a couple that were especially relevant to today's talk. So one of them we saw some example of with Buffalo is a strategy of obfuscating or obfuscation, in which we find some way to either misdirect or at least temporarily conceal or distract from the true purpose of an intervention. Not necessarily hide it altogether, but find ways of providing some distraction so people aren't dwelling or putting an undue amount of attention on the persuasive goal and actually just experiencing the interaction as it is. And we found that obfuscation is a way to, for example, increase immersion in a persuasive experience or persuasive interaction. And there are different techniques of obfuscating. One could be the way you frame the interaction or frame the experience. So with Buffalo, for example, we used this in the way we advertised or marketed the game. So if you have a chance to see a copy of the game, nowhere on the materials, on the box itself, or the instructions to identify the game as being one that deals with stereotypes. We are very careful of using more neutral language. For example, testing general knowledge or testing pop culture knowledge or historical knowledge. And it's only after the game do we have sort of debriefing materials where players can start to have a conversation about the relevance of stereotypes to the game. We've done some studies even finding that if we tell players ahead of time that Buffalo is a game about prejudice or about bias or stereotypes, it affects both their experience of the game. They're less likely to enjoy the game because sort of their defenses are up. They don't expect it to be a fun experience, or they're too careful in their responses, or they resent it in some way. And it reduces the impact of the game on players' attitudes or perceptions about social categories. So in this way, having some light obfuscation about the underlying purpose of the game, or waiting to reveal that purpose until after the game, it can cross the line into being sneaky. So we're pretty careful about not being entirely deceptive. And so in this case, the fact that we're not necessarily completely hiding the fact the game is about stereotypes. And in fact, it becomes pretty obvious as soon as you start playing, because a lot of the words themselves are drawn directly from known cultural stereotypes. And we're really careful about providing sort of a complete sort of explanation of the game afterward. So we view this as a sort of entry point to having sort of a bottom-up experience that's not affected by your expectations ahead of time. And so we try to steer away from techniques that are completely deceptive or completely manipulative, and instead allow players or readers to discover the persuasive intention through the experience. So in this case, not telling them ahead of time, but not hiding it in the experience itself, or at least not hiding it fully. But you're right, it could easily cross this line into feeling unethical or manipulative. So we're constantly grappling with that question of how can we balance this desire, this goal to be somewhat, have a lighter touch with our persuasive approach, and having some level of transparency about the impact or the intention behind it. Yeah, it's an excellent point. So obfuscation is one such technique. Another technique, which will really provide the foundation for the examples of research that I'll present today, is a technique of distancing, which essentially is finding ways of providing some level of psychological distance between an individual and either themselves or their reality when they enter the world of the fictional narrative or the game itself. And so that could be fictionalization in and of itself as a form of distancing. You're representing reality in a space that's not real, but nonetheless could be experienced, at least psychologically, as real once you enter into that space. So fiction itself can provide that distance from reality. In addition, using techniques such as metaphor, symbolism, allegory, those are ways of taking real life concepts, real life topics, and translating them into a different form. Actually, absolutely, all forms of literature do this quite well. So using settings or characters to represent topics in ways that are symbolic or allegorical. Films, television, games, stories, all of these use these techniques very well. Other techniques like hyperbole and dark humor are ways of maybe exaggerating reality or casting a humorous skew or slant on reality. All these serve the purpose of providing some level of safety in confronting a topic that might be otherwise sensitive or uncomfortable, or something you wouldn't be naturally inclined to confront or think about. And so essentially the goal here is to provide a safe experience, a way to grapple with elements of reality, whether it's reality of your own self, your identity, realities about the world around you, realities about your attitudes about the world or other people, other groups, in ways that feel psychologically safer. So our goal at the end of the day is to provide a psychologically safe experience that also can be transformative and enlightening, but at the same time preserve some level of agency. We're not necessarily intending in all cases to change people's behaviors or attitudes. We're hoping to at least plant the seed, to at least consider, for example, alternative viewpoints, or to confront things like your own biases or your own views about other groups. And a lot of the work that I do, especially in the space of fiction and games, relies on a core concept that was the basis for my dissertation in social psychology, this psychological phenomenon known as experience, that we've come to call at least experience taking. So essentially, experience taking is the phenomenon by which you feel like you actually embody and become a character in a game or a story. You fully take on their persona, their identity. You sort of lose yourself in that moment and feel like you are that character for the duration of that experience. And so anything that happens to the character, any thought that comes to mind, any actions they're taking, any emotions that they experience, you feel as if they're yours in that moment. So you're not you in that space, you're actually embodying this other entity that's provided for you in that game or fictional world. And so a lot of the work that I did early on in my career was more, I would classify more as basic psychological research, sort of understanding this core phenomenon of experience taking and studying both its antecedents, what variables might increase the likelihood of somebody having experience taking occur to a larger extent, but also measuring the impact that experience taking with narratives might have on behaviors or even your self-concept. And so my dissertation, for example, found if stories were more likely to exert a higher effect on experience taking, that readers came out of a fictional narrative reporting that they were more likely to feel they embodied the character, we also found that affected things like their self-concept. So if you embodied a character who had a specific personality trait, you're more likely to feel like you possess that trait, at least temporarily, after emerging from that narrative space. So you're integrating elements of that character into your own self-concept or your own self-view. In some cases, it might even affect your behavior. So if you embody or inhabit this persona or this role of a character who exhibits a behavior through the course of the narrative, we also have studies where we measured whether readers, after they emerge from that space, also are more likely to exhibit those same behaviors. And a lot of that work was in the space of pro-social behavior change. So we studied the effect of experience taking with characters who voted or volunteered, and found that readers themselves are more likely in their own lives to then volunteer or vote in an election if they had higher experience taking with a character who exhibited those same behaviors. So this work provided us the foundation to say that fictional narratives can be quite transformative in connecting you to another person, and then as a result, affect the way that you sort of take on their traits and behaviors yourself, at least temporarily. And some of these effects persisted even beyond a week or two beyond the experience of reading a short story. So in the case of the voting example, we measured voting even a couple of weeks after the participants had read the story. Yeah, it's related to the produce effect, and that produce effect, if you haven't heard that concept, essentially means if you're embodying specifically an avatar in a virtual or game space, you sort of take on characteristics you associate with that avatar. So work has shown, for example, if you inhabit a virtual space and you have an avatar that's more attractive or taller, you exhibit more confidence in those virtual spaces, and it can have some carryover effect. Or if you see an avatar that represents yourself and you see that avatar doing something like exercising, you're more likely to exercise yourself afterward. You should take on or internalize those traits. So there's some overlap there in terms of the effect of that exposure. I think the key difference might be the produce effect can occur even if you don't fully embody that role. You can have it occur even if you just are given sort of a brief look at the avatar. If you're playing that role, whereas experience taking is more about deeply feeling, so psychologically merging fully with a character. And it doesn't involve necessarily an avatar. It can be fully imagined. So the work that I'm presenting here in this slide, there were no avatars at all in this space. It's more just imagining, reading a text-based narrative and imagining yourself as that character. Yeah, but absolutely. So there's definitely some overlap there in terms of the impact of exposure to some character representation. But in this early work, at least, we looked at the effect of imagining what's happening to a character and sort of simulating this experience in your own mind rather than using a visual representation in the form of an avatar. Oops. Sorry, I went back too much. I think my slides have a mind of their own. All right. Some of the work we also did early on was to look at what variables might increase or decrease the likelihood of experience taking happening. So we found in this, and again, this early work was in the space of text-based narratives, mostly short works of fiction that we constructed for the studies. And so we varied a number of factors in these stories that participants were reading, and found, for example, that one way to increase experience taking was to introduce some basis of similarity between either a reader or a player and a character early in the narrative. So introducing some shared characteristic, like a group membership. So in the case of our early work, one example would be reading about a character who attended the same university as oneself. That sort of cue to similarity was enough to increase the likelihood of experience taking happening. They also varied the point of view from which the story was told, and found in general that using first person visual perspective or first person voice in a written narrative versus third person increased the likelihood of experience taking happening. In another line of work, we looked at the effect of either increasing or reducing players' level of self-consciousness. And we found in general that reducing self-consciousness, so one method of doing that is to engage in sort of a mindfulness meditation exercise where you become depersonalized, where you sort of loosen all of your associations with yourself and reality. That was a way to increase experience taking. And conversely, increasing self-consciousness, so for example, seeing your reflection in a mirror right before reading a story actually reduced experience taking. The idea being that the more self-conscious you are, the more aware you are of yourself when you're in that narrative space, the harder it is to sort of forget yourself temporarily and step into the role of the character and embody that character's persona. So in general, all these are factors that help to create this sense of merger with a character, embodiment of a character in a narrative. Some other work that we did later looked at using experience taking as a mechanism to start to increase empathy and reduce prejudice towards social outgroups. And we found that one technique that was really effective at doing this was delaying the revelation of the character's group membership. So if you introduce a character in a narrative, you allow sort of a level of affinity or connection to form between the reader or player and the character, and then later on reveal something about the character that might otherwise be distancing or off-putting, including an out-group membership. That could be a way to overall increase the level of connection with that character, and as a result, reduce prejudice. And we found that this was the case. So my culminating studies for my dissertation looked at using experience taking as a way to reduce prejudice toward racial outgroups and LGBTQ+ outgroups. So we did a number of studies that were fairly straightforward in their design. We've had a short story about the day in the life of a character who belonged to a specific outgroup relative to the participants in the study. So for example, a character who was African-American with white participants. And we just delayed the revelation of that group membership to occur sometime later in the story versus earlier, and found that delayed revelation was a way to increase experience taking, because essentially what was happening was once readers formed a psychological connection or affinity with a character, even when they found out something about the character that might have been distancing, like an outgroup membership, they were less likely to see that as off-putting. They basically accepted that as sort of part of the character, and their experience taking itself was not interrupted by that. And at the end, we also measured things like their perceptions of that outgroup or stereotypes toward the outgroup, and found that in general, experience taking then led to reductions and prejudice, with a promotion of more positive attitudes toward that group as a result of it taking on that character's persona. I'm going to do a deep dive now and talk about one specific set of studies that we ran in the space of game design that use some of these same principles of experience taking and delayed revelation. In this case, it was a game that we wanted to study for its impact on gender bias, specifically with younger male players. This is a board game called Monarch that had a successful Kickstarter campaign a number of years ago. But what was unique about this game at the time, and maybe to a certain extent still today, is that all of the characters in the game were women. And in fact, you're playing the role of a sibling princess in the game. It's a fairly straightforward strategy board game in which you're competing with your fellow players to amass the most impressive court. And by doing that, essentially in the game, you're collecting cards that you put into a tableau that represent different elements that you have in your court that represent either symbols or instruments of power or prestige or influence. These could be objects, they could be events, they could be people, but essentially that's the way the game works. But what's again unique about the game, especially at the time, is that it was one of the few games in which all the characters were women. There was not a single character who was a man in the game. In fact, when my colleagues shopped this game around to potential game publishers before opting to go the crowdsourcing route, there was a distinct resistance to this game for the fact that there were no men in the game whatsoever, except in some cases in these sort of secondary cards that you might amass. But the main protagonists and characters in the game were all women. So here's one quote from a Reddit discussion about the game that's representative of the sentiment at the time. A sizable number of individuals, both of gamers themselves as well as members of publishing companies, questioned the decision to not include any male characters in the game. That there's this worry that we'd be turning off a large portion of men who might be otherwise inclined to play a strategy board game by not including any men characters. And so we wanted to do some research on this, especially understanding how younger male players might respond to this game if it had all women characters before we actually went the route of publishing it. And so we did a number of studies, including a follow-up to the work I mentioned earlier with delayed revelation, to look at what design decisions we might make with the game that could affect boys' likelihood of having experience taking occur with these princess roles that they were going to be inhabiting in this game. And the sort of cultural context in which this research occurred is such that and I think this still remains to be the case today, although tides are changing slowly but surely, I believe. But in general, there's been a larger number of social repercussions and sanctions against boys experimenting with their femininity, of exploring and enjoying feminine pursuits, such as using makeup, for example. So in the United States, at least, there was a surprisingly vitriolic controversy when a magazine editor published a profile of her son and showing her painting his toenails pink. It led to sort of a cultural debate in the United States that basically on one side that questioned this was basically saying that this is representation of masculinity going to the wayside, that it's destroying the lives of boys in our culture. So these hyperbolic, sort of exaggerated reactions to this fairly innocuous media profile. And there are a number of related stories that relate to these higher social punishments for boys exploring and expressing their femininity. So for example, playing with toys that have some feminine associations, or dressing in ways that might be more associated with femininity than masculinity. So cases where boys were expelled from school for wearing dresses or makeup. And in general, more harsher sanctions in place for boys exploring their femininity than there might be for example, girls exploring their masculinity. And so essentially we wanted to tackle this problem head on to see if we could start to sort of counteract these norms that sort of dissuade exploration of femininity in boys. And so we wanted to use this game as a way to see if we could start to plant the seeds for exploring and reducing the threat of embodying feminine roles, or in this case, embodying the persona of a character as a princess in a game. And the way we did that, we wanted to try two different design methods in our studies. And in the first study, we used the delayed revelation technique I mentioned earlier, where we waited till partway through the game to reveal to boys that they were taking on the role of princesses. And the second study, we varied the artwork to either be higher or lower in stereotypicality in terms of femininity in the depiction. And I'll show you some examples of that. And in general, we wanted to see what effect those design choices, so the delayed revelation of their roles in study 1, and the use of either more or less stereotypically feminine artwork in study 2, would affect, one, how they experienced the game, how positively they rated the game after playing it, including their evaluations of whether the game was more appropriate for boys or girls. We also measured their experience taking with their princess roles after playing, and we also had measures of gender stereotype rejection, which I'll explain in a moment. So in the first study, we did a delayed revelation method, like I mentioned earlier. So in the study, these were mostly pre-adolescent or early adolescent boys in the northeastern United States who were randomly assigned to one of two conditions. In the early revelation condition, the players were told at the start of the game that their roles were princesses in the game. The other half were randomly assigned to a delayed revelation version, where they only found out they were princesses partway through the game, and the revelation occurred through a card that was drawn for the group, an event card that revealed to them that they were actually princesses, not just siblings vying for the throne. And so otherwise, the game itself was identical, except for the revelation of their princess role happening either earlier or later in the experience. And following gameplay, individuals in the study completed measures of, for example, their evaluation of the game, how rewarding they found the game, how appropriate they thought the game was for boys versus girls. We measured experience taking with a standard scale that I developed as part of my dissertation work, essentially in which individuals report the extent to which they felt like as if they were embodying the role they were given, in this case, a princess role in the game. And finally, we measured in this study gender norm acceptance versus rejection with a new measure that we developed specifically for this study that we wanted to try out. I'll give you a bit more detail here. And essentially, this measure itself represents another example of embedded design in that we were obscuring the purpose of this measure from participants as a way to measure spontaneous endorsement versus rejection of gender stereotypes. So the way this measure worked is participants were given a set of sentences that were identified as the first line of a short story. We told them that some author had written, in fact, it was true. We had an author who wrote these sentences that were depicting a character whose name did not give away their gender identity necessarily. They weren't to be ambiguous in terms of what gender identity they might have. And participants were instructed to write the second line to continue the story however they wanted. And at the end, we used what pronoun they used as an indication of what gender they were assigning the character. So I should mention this study was conducted back in 2018, 2019. This is much earlier than when pronouns became prominent in popular discourse. So by and large, the participants in the study, for better or for worse, adhered to gender binary pronouns. They often used he versus she. There was very few, if any, cases of them using non-binary or they pronouns for this study, but it worked well in this context back in 2018, 2019. So essentially, we had sentences that varied in their stereotypicality, femininity versus masculinity. So in the feminine sentences, the characters were doing things like exhibiting emotion or being nurturing, which are stereotypically associated more with women versus men, or femininity versus masculinity. In the masculine sentences, the sentences had the character exhibiting something that along the lines of something more powerful or agentic, taking charge, showing leadership, for example. And again, these are stereotypically masculine traits. Then mixed in, there were some neutral items as well. And so we basically used whatever pronoun that the participants spontaneously used in the second sentence as an indication of what gender they were assigning to these characters. And it worked really well for our purposes. We were really pleased with how it panned out. So I'll go through some of the results. I won't go through all the full set, but I'll just explain some of the key findings from this first study. So here we have some of the game evaluation measures. So we have, again, the early reveal versus the delayed reveal condition. So we found the delayed revelation, again, where boys found out they were princesses only partway through the game, not at the beginning. They reported finding the game more rewarding after playing it. They were more likely to say the game was equally appropriate for boys versus girls. So this midpoint of the scale, they're right around the midpoint of 4.5 out of 9. So they were basically saying the game was not any more appropriate for boys versus girls to play. And then this next measure is experience taking. So again, we used a self-report scale where participants told us how much they felt like they became their character of princess in the game. And as you can see, there's a higher rating of experience taking and in the delayed condition. And finally, here is the measure that I described earlier with the use of personal pronouns. So we found in this case an effect on the feminine sentences. These are, again, sentences where the character in the sentence was exhibiting, say, emotional reactions or nurturing behavior. And we found that this is a huge effect. We were surprised by how large it was, in fact, that boys were much more likely to assign he or him pronouns to those characters who were doing things like being caring or exhibiting emotional reactions to experiences. So in this case, they were directly rejecting those behaviors as being feminine by making the character, in their minds at least, casting that character as a man versus a woman. We didn't see a similar effect on the masculine sentences. So there's maybe something about the fact that they were inhabiting these princess roles. They started to sort of internalize some of these traits that they might be typically have associated to be more feminine. So as a result of embodying the role of princess, they seem to be having a stronger association between boys and being emotional or caring and communal. I should mention one thing I didn't mention about the game is that one design element is that in the game itself, certain decisions were meant to be more communal, meaning you had choices where you could pull resources together with your competitors for some greater good, like counteracting famine in the land, for example. And so that's why we think this came about, because in the game itself, players were embodying and enacting these communal roles to a greater extent. And we found also an impact of experience taking there. The more players experienced higher levels of experience taking, the more communal they were in the game as well. So both of these are indicators that there's some change happening in the way boys are thinking about, especially these more communal behaviors of being nurturing and caregiving, and more likely to embody or inhabit or internalize those characteristics themselves. Right, I'm gonna pause. I think I missed a question in the chat. So Tim's asking, seems to hint that this approach is less effective after people are more aware of pronouns. At least in this case, we had a debriefing process where we asked participants if they were sort of consciously aware of the pronouns they were using. And by and large, they weren't. They just thought they were answering spontaneously. They didn't really pick up on their own patterns. This effect seems to be somewhat, at least, implicit or maybe slightly unconscious. They didn't pick up on the fact this was happening. We asked them if they had any sort of strategy or any pattern they noticed in answering those questions. And by and large, they didn't really pick up on it. It could be the fact that we sort of intermixed these questions such that the masculine and feminine and neutral were all sort of interspersed, but they didn't consciously pick up on the fact this was happening in this study, at least. I'll briefly mention study 2. It goes a bit away from this obfuscation and meta design, but I think it's worth mentioning because if you're interested at all in some depictions of avatars or characters. So essentially in this study, we varied the artwork that was given to boys when this is a totally different sample. These are boys who hadn't played the game before. They weren't the same participants from study 1. But in this case, we told all the boys at the beginning they were princesses. So basically all of these were early reveal participants. But in this case, we gave them a little card, an art card that depicted the character that they were assigned in the game. And depending on the group they were in, the art itself was either more stereotypical or less stereotypical. So here is one example of an attempt to create a less versus more stereotypical depiction of a character. So we try to preserve some elements between them. So we each had headdresses, we had some of the same color scheme in place, some of the same physical characteristics. But as you can see, certain features were distinctly different between the less stereotypical depiction on the left and the more stereotypical depiction on the right. We essentially used the Disney princess art as the motivation or inspiration for the more stereotypical depiction on the right, like the large eyes, and so forth, the more feminine elements, whereas we included more masculine elements like steel headdresses and the more masculine depictions, or the less feminine depictions on the left. And so we had different versions of these, and we randomly assigned different groups. Each boy received a different art card, but it was in the same style, either the more stereotypical or the less stereotypical. But otherwise, again, the game was identical, and much like study 1, we measured outcomes after playing, with the basic prediction that giving boys the less stereotypical art would be a sort of a conduit for higher levels of experience taking. So again, randomly assigned to either more stereotypical or less stereotypical art depictions, afterward we measured game evaluations, experience taking. And in this study, we measured, we wanted to see if we would see any sort of change in boys' own self-concept. In this case, we had them rate their own traits using a measure that included both stereotypically masculine and feminine traits to see if we would see any change in the way boys were internalizing some of the traits. We saw some hints of this in study 1. We wanted to go further and see if at least temporarily boys were starting to sort of take on or at least embrace both masculine and feminine roles and feminine personalities traits after playing the game as a result of embodying their princess character. So here are some, again, game evaluation items. We found as an analog to the delayed revelation using less stereotypical art. made boys more interested in playing the game again. Much like in study 1, they found the game equally appropriate for boys and girls as opposed to more appropriate for girls than boys. They reported higher levels of experience taking, again, this embodiment of their princess role in the game compared to the more stereotypical art condition. And in general, they rated themselves higher on both feminine traits and masculine traits. So again, this is the measure I mentioned earlier, where we had traits such as powerful, independent, masculine for masculine traits versus tender, compassionate, and feminine. So in general, boys rated themselves higher on both masculine and feminine traits. Now, we're not quite sure. One hypothesis we had for explaining that was that maybe the perception of higher femininity might have been triggering some level of threat, and as a result, to compensate for that somewhat, boys were taking on this self-perception of more masculine traits as well. The other hypothesis would be that because the artwork itself depicted both masculine and feminine elements, there were some art elements and elements of the characters' clothing and depiction that were both masculine and feminine, that those were both having an effect on boys' self-concept. We weren't not quite sure what was happening here, but we found in general that they were more likely to internalize both feminine and to a higher degree more masculine traits as well. But the effect on the feminine traits was especially pronounced, showing that at least to some extent, embodying the role of princess made boys internalize traits that are stereotypically associated more with women than men. So in general, we found that both the use of delayed revelation and the use of less stereotypical artwork were ways of increasing experience taking with princess characters in the game. And that as a result of experience taking, we saw some evidence of a reduction in gender bias or gender stereotyping, and essentially, hopefully set the stage for boys to start to question cultural norms that cast a negative slant on femininity in boys. That maybe makes them maybe a bit more free to explore both masculinity and femininity in their own experience, their own identity. And there's a number of benefits to that. As an aside, a number of psychologists have shown the benefits of what's called psychological androgyny, so taking on and embracing both masculine and feminine aspects of your personality. It's been shown to be correlated with higher levels of creativity, for example, or altruism or empathy. And so we found that that was so the rationale for doing this is to start to see this positive transformation in ways that sort of takes away some of the stigma of confronting femininity in boys. All right, a quick time check. I'm almost done. I'm going to talk about just a number of other projects and sort of give you a sense of some of the other findings that have emerged in this work. And I'll close with some examples of current ongoing projects in my lab, just to give you a sense of what we're working on now. But this slide, I wanted to present a few other examples of the benefits of using fictionalization in either narratives or games in ways that might allow players or readers to confront or process or think about topics that might be otherwise uncomfortable or threatening to them, to have some level of safety and openness in confronting them. So the first example, we wanted to see the effect of fictionalization in changing players' attitudes about infectious diseases. This was way back we started this work in 2012 on a game that essentially was about vaccination and herd immunity called Pox. And so the original version of the game was fairly straightforward. It used a realistic narrative involving the outbreak of a disease in a community. But we created a very timely, so this was pre-COVID, but definitely still very timely. So we created a companion version of the game that instead of using a realistic narrative, used a zombie narrative. So instead of having a disease breaking out in the community, we have zombies running rampant in the community. But otherwise, the game was essentially the same. It's a board game where you're deploying some vaccine chips essentially to fence in or contain a disease from spreading out on the board on other places. Not unlike Pandemic, but more abstract than Pandemic, the board game. But we found importantly that in one of our studies, we randomly assigned players to either the zombie version or the realistic version, and found that players in the zombie version, after playing the game, reported higher levels of empathy toward people with real infectious diseases, which might seem somewhat counterintuitive. But the main idea here is that we found one key explanation is that the zombie version of the game invited higher levels of immersion and transportation. So players felt more engaged, more immersed, more involved in the zombie version. In contrast, players, the more realistic version, afterward reported feeling like the game was too heavy, too serious. It dealt with topics like death in ways that didn't feel that engaging. So they were much less transported by the game. So even though the game itself, the mechanics, the actions, the events were basically identical across the two versions, just changing the theming and the skinning of the game to be about a zombie outbreak as opposed to a disease outbreak made all the difference. In this case, increasing outcomes like empathy after playing. So we're not the only ones doing this. The Centers for Disease Control in the US have used zombie narratives in their public relations materials, in their educational materials to teach about things like herd immunity and vaccination. So I think they understand the same thing, that they're using a more engaging narrative that also might sort of reduce some of the threat that might be involved in thinking about topics like disease and death might be a way of getting that message through more easily. And we found something similar in this study in example 1. In example 2, this is a more recent line of work in which we are comparing sort of testimonials written about experiences with prejudice and bias that are presented to people that don't belong to those groups necessarily. So in this study, we had a first-person account of experiences with gender bias in higher education. And so in this case, a woman reported experiences of bias from her professor in her physics class. Essentially cases where stereotypes about gender were perpetuated in the way that the character was treated or the interactions that she had with her professor and other classmates. And we took the same exact first-person written narrative and randomly assigned people to a condition either in which they were told the story was fictitious or they were told it was factual. So essentially they were told it was a work of creative fiction or autobiographical nonfiction, written in sort of a creative writing style, like a creative nonfiction style. And simply changing that label between fiction and fact made all the difference in how people responded to the story. And by and large, if readers rather were told that the story was a work of fiction, they showed much higher levels of empathy and understanding toward the character, were more likely to believe she actually was experiencing gender bias in these encounters, viewed the character as more sympathetic, and viewed more positive characteristics on the trait. In contrast, if readers were told that the work was autobiographical and nonfiction, they had a much different perception. That the character was exaggerating her experiences. Maybe she wasn't experiencing bias. They questioned it to a greater extent. They had a more negative impression of her as well. They're more likely to say she was whiny, for example, is one of the traits that came out as significant. So they had this more negative impression of the character in the story. And we're just starting to understand what's going on here, but what seems to be happening to some extent is that both men and women who read the factual labeled version of the story were threatened in some way by it. So for example, men seem to be threatened by the fact that there was a male character in the story exhibiting bias, so they minimized that. They were less likely, for example, to say that the professor, who was a man, was biased. Whereas women were threatened by the fact that they might have started to identify with the woman in the story and were threatened by that. They wanted to minimize their own sort of vulnerability to experiencing bias themselves, so they exhibited less empathy. But the label of fiction changed that completely. And it seems to be happening that this fictional label creates sort of this safe boundary between reality and what's occurring in the narrative in ways that make people more receptive, more open-minded, more empathetic. So we're doing some follow-up work now to explore what processes are happening there in seeing this difference between this label of fiction versus factual, because the story itself was identical in both cases, but the reactions were quite different. And one final example I wanted to mention, we're doing some work trying to empower and strengthen the identities of members of marginalized groups. In this third example, in this case, we were trying to challenge the stereotype that members of racial minority groups are less likely to succeed or excel in science or STEM contexts more broadly. So we designed a game in which players themselves were taking on the role of scientists. But in this case, we used a different method. In this case, I would consider this third example to be a form of obfuscation. In this case, we deliberately made the game a horror theme. We upped all the horror elements in the game to be quite scary and terrifying. So we had sort of a horrific narrative where you were exploring a haunted lab that had dangers around every corner, zombies and other things coming out, but at the same time trying to discover a cure or an antidote to what was happening in the game. And we had other elements like artwork, in some cases music, that would increase the sense of suspense. And we found in general, in one study, we compared a version of the game that used those horror elements versus another version that didn't. And we found in general that using these suspenseful elements allowed players to misattribute or misexplain any threat that was being evoked by the fact that they were exploring science, which could be a threatening domain for the players themselves. If they're able to explain that away by saying the game itself was causing their level of anxiety, it was the scary music or the zombies or the other horror elements that were increasing their anxiety, they're less likely to think they were being anxious about the science content itself. And so as a result, we found that players are more likely to have experience taking with their scientist characters if those horror elements were in place compared to if they weren't. They didn't have a sort of an alibi or a scapegoat, so to speak, to explain away their anxiety. They're more likely to perceive their anxiety as being caused by the fact this was a science game. So if they have this excuse for their anxiety, that was a way to take away that threat and make them more comfortable and willing to take on this role of scientist and start to see themselves as scientists as a result. All right, and just to close, I just wanted to give, I also wanted to mention a couple of examples of real other games that I think use these techniques I mentioned really well, like delayed revelation or obfuscation. So I'll just give these as recommendations to check out on your own time if you have the interest. Gone Home uses delayed revelation really well. Dream Daddy uses, I think, obfuscation. You think the game is going to be about one thing once you actually go into it. It's completely different from your expectations and really in ways that I think are really emotionally powerful. It plays with stereotypes really in interesting ways. This War of Mine takes a very heavy, another very timely topic, in this case being part of a war-torn nation, and integrates both fictional elements and realistic elements in ways that I think are really compelling, especially in its narrative. And Papers, Please, also another timely topic of immigration. It puts you directly in the role of an immigration officer and making these very complex, morally difficult decisions about whether to let people into a country, even if their papers aren't completely in order, but they have a compelling personal story. So these are games that use fictional elements, I think, and narrative specifically in some of these cases in ways that are really powerful and transformative. And just to close, I'll briefly discuss a couple of projects that are new and ongoing in my lab. In one project, we're looking at using fan fiction as a way to support members of marginalized groups. In this first attempt, we're focusing on transgender teens. So in this case, we're having teens being the authors of fictional narratives, so taking fictional characters they identify with and using them as the basis to express their own autobiographical experiences. So we're hoping to see, and we're finding some evidence that the use of fan fiction gives some psychological distance between what might be a really sort of oppressive or traumatizing realities. It gives a safer space to express identity questions or dilemmas or challenges they're facing. In this project, we're pairing teens with college students, near peers, to write these stories collaboratively so that the near peers can provide advice through the shared story they're writing in the form of another character in the fan fiction piece. So fan fiction itself is a popular alternative for members of marginalized groups, including queer individuals, to explore and recast or rethink popular characters from fictional canons. And we're looking at to see if that could be a way to explore one's own identity in safe ways as a way to increase mental health outcomes and increase perceptions of social support. So we're right now deploying a study where we're pairing teens and college students to write these semi-autobiographical fan fiction pieces together and studying how it's affecting teens' self-perceptions and their emotions and mental health. In another project, we're designing an interactive fiction game that's meant to help empower members of marginalized groups to navigate the healthcare system. And what this game does, I think, what I think is interesting about it is that in the game, players take on the role of a community manager. They're basically interacting with other characters who are community members who have specific problems in relation to the healthcare system. So the characters might be ones for whom English is a second language. So they're having trouble navigating interactions with their doctors because language barriers are an issue. Or they might be interacting with a character who's experiencing racial microaggressions in their interactions with healthcare providers. But what's happening here is that these other characters, these non-player characters, are actually meant to be ones that represent problems or challenges that players themselves might face, because this game is being designed for members of underserved or underrepresented minority populations. But by taking on the role of community manager, where you're helping them solve those problems, you're trying to provide some level of distance from them and increase a sense of self-efficacy, because you're the one as the community manager, so grappling with these problems from a distance view, but thinking through some of the possible solutions for them. And we're hoping that players will internalize the solutions they're offering to the non-player characters, like Mrs. Lee, for example, in this screenshot, and ways that will help them feel more empowered if they experience the same challenges in their own experience in the healthcare system. And finally, one of my other students, Erica Cruz, is leading a project designing games, counter-space games, as we're calling them, for women of color in STEM. These are games essentially meant to counteract experiences of bias or prejudice in STEM. So games that cultivate a sense of joy and belonging, cultivate a sense of pride and identity, to counteract any messages or experiences that perpetuate bias or inequity in their higher education experiences in classes or with peers. So we're designing games that cultivate these values at their core as sort of a counterpoint and maybe a form of resistance to oppression in their real life contexts. All right, I'm going to stop there, and hopefully there's plenty of time for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was amazing, Geoff. I learned a lot and I have lots of questions. So maybe if people have questions, they can either raise their hand or say. I have a question to start with. I wanted to ask, why do you think it's more safe space when it's less honest or less direct? Why obfuscating and distancing are effective here, from your point of view?
Yeah, I think it fits with a broader set of factors that seem to create that sort of higher level of openness or receptivity. I think it fits within strategies that are meant to, I won't say create a clean slate when people are going into these experiences, but basically try to reduce either consciousness or awareness of factors that might block receptivity or openness. So it could be factors about their own sort of existing attitudes about sort of an issue. It could be their own self-perceptions when it comes to being a member of a marginalized group. So we're trying to find factors that might, when you're entering into these spaces and entering into the world of the fictional narrative, or entering into what we call the magic circle of a game, where you're supposed to leave reality behind and to embrace and experience what's happening in that space from the bottom up. Like these methods of like obfuscation or using sort of misdirection are sort of part of these broader constellation of techniques that basically are trying to make people as sort of open as possible when they enter those spaces, to not be sort of resistant or to be affected by their pre-existing either dispositions or attitudes or their prior experiences or beliefs, and allow them to absorb or take on the experience in that space more authentically and more spontaneously. And so in general, there's been a number of studies, both in my lab and in my colleagues' labs, that have looked specifically at the power of fiction of doing that. So one of the last findings I presented with the labeling of fiction, just knowing something is fictional seems to prime a mindset that is more receptive. So these other techniques like obfuscation or delayed revelation are just meant to sort of enhance those effects even more. And the bottom line is it's not necessarily in the goal of being deceptive, it's more the goal of creating an experience that's not interfered with by factors that might be disruptive. So factors that might make you less inclined to either enter that space in the first place or to be open to the perspectives or the ideas that are being presented there.
I see. Thank you. We have first question from Soyash Joshi. Is that correct? Sorry.
Hey, thank you. I am more interested in educational games, like promoting STEM education amongst kids. And I see games can be a great means to do that. Any advice or tips around how to make games that are more fun at the same time educational, especially games that promote STEM education?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of my colleagues in my department at Carnegie Mellon are grappling with that same question. And I think seeing some of the challenges that come into play with trying to design educational games. I think one pitfall that a lot of projects I've seen just in general in that space fall into would be trying to basically just add game elements to a pretty traditional learning game. So imagining just taking a typical, like very straightforward game about, say, algebraic equations, and then throwing on sort of a game element like putting in like a fictional narrative, but you're still doing math equation solving, like in a very straightforward way. Some of my colleagues described it as basically the chocolate covered broccoli approach, where you're taking something that's not fun or immersive and trying to just cover it with something that's meant to be entertaining. And by and large, it doesn't really work very well. So the alternative that my colleagues and I are exploring is trying to find ways of, essentially this fits within the embedded design approach, and finding ways of allowing players to learn or practice skills or methods in a STEM context or a learning context that makes sense within the confines of the parameters of the game itself. And so one of the examples I mentioned earlier, the game about scientific exploration, like players were doing things that fit like perfectly with the role they're given in the game. In this case, they were playing a team of explorers, so going through this haunted laboratory, making discoveries, forming hypotheses. We never used a formal language. You didn't say, oh, you're learning the scientific method here. So your first step is to collect data. But instead, like through the actions in the game, you were collecting information, then using it to make some decisions, using deductive reasoning, forming hypotheses, and testing them, evaluating them, and going back and revising them. So you're doing all that, but we didn't actually use like the formal language of the scientific method in that process. So we integrated those activities within the game itself. So the learning itself maybe was less explicit. But afterward, then we had a debriefing and explained, oh, what you're actually doing was part of the scientific method. So it sort of fits with this broader sort of perspective on embedded design, where if you don't draw undue attention to the fact that you're learning and just make it part of the experience, it's part of what you're doing in the game, that might be one way of counteracting that. And there's been a somewhat of a small but growing push toward some game-based curricula for fields like STEM, where the learning is happening through these active embodiment of these roles and making decisions in games, or solving puzzles or solving problems in games as sort of a stepping stone toward the more formal learning methods. So in that way, I would say, in general, I think it's often preferable to have sort of a game-based approach be either tightly interwoven with the curricular method or sort of as an entry point to these topics. I think it could be a good way to introduce some experiences or introduce ideas or skills that you then use more formal methods to teach, especially if there's some level of resistance or threat that students might experience. So I think one benefit of using games for learning is, again, that it reduces this level of psychological threat that might otherwise be experienced by members of either underrepresented or marginalized or stereotype targeted groups in those domains. So I think in general, the more you can use a compelling sort of narrative or a compelling game space where you're practicing these skills as a way to start learning them, I think that's often preferable than, again, the chocolate covered broccoli approach that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you. Second question from Tim.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. It's really excellent. So I'm really impressed because I'm more, doing those hardware technical person. So when we measure stuff, we usually, reaction time, that type of objective stuff. So it's really impressive to see all kind of very brilliant and novel measurements you use, or probably in the psychology community. So I wonder, so there are two questions following that line. So the first one would be, are there standard questionnaire or standard tool to measure, say, the empathy or stereotype bias? And if we are not using that, then how can you, compare with other works, right? So that would be the first question. And the second question would be, so all these measures, I suppose you did after they say play the game, right? And then how can you? I understand that you basically you plant a seed into their mind so that you eventually you feel that it might change their behaviors. Then I wonder, the question would be, then how can you measure the real long-term behavior change? Like, how would be the tools there to do that type of measurements?
Yeah, those are both excellent questions. So I'll tackle the first question. So just to recap, the question, make sure I understood it correctly, was how do you balance the integration of some existing validated scales with new measures that we're creating? How do you know that these original measures that we've used in our research are actually getting at the outcomes that we intend to measure? So I think in general, we try to use an approach that combines existing methods or measures whenever possible. And so there are standardized validated measures of things like empathy. So the work of psychologist Daniel Batson, for example, we used a lot of his measures in some of our studies where we measure things like empathic concern, where there's specific, say, emotional reactions you can measure towards somebody. So we definitely have used those in our research in combination with some of the more original measures. I think the one reason we often use a combined approach is that one limitation of traditional self-report scales, like measures of empathy, measures of bias or prejudice, is that they're highly prone to response biases, meaning if you realize they're very overt in what they're measuring, so it's easy to give a socially desirable response to those measures. And so one reason or one justification for using more embedded or more stealthy approaches to measurement, but also seeing how they correlate or relate to those more traditional explicit measures, is to try to get at people's responses more spontaneously in ways in which their own response biases might be less likely to come into play. But in general, like our next step in developing original measures is to do that validation work to see if scores on, say, a more embedded or implicit measure of empathy or prejudice or bias, do they relate to standardized validated measures? Can we actually validate these measures so they can become part of the catalog or tool of measures that people can use to measure outcomes, especially if they have these concerns about response biases that might plague more traditional self-report measures. The other thing we're doing in our work is to not just include measurement afterward, but try to find ways of embedding measurement within the experience or interaction itself. And that's, in certain genres, lend themselves better for that than others. So we're using a lot of interactive narrative approaches in our current research, where we have these sort of digital games where you're choosing response options for characters in the game, and it can lead to different paths, basically a branching narrative. In some cases, we're using that format as a measurement tool. So we can use the choices that players are making in the game as an indication of transformation, at least in the short term, as well as another sort of category of measurements of these behavioral measures within the game experience. Again, in cases where the players don't even necessarily realize that they're being measured at all, their choices just seem like they're spontaneous, but they're actually giving us some indication of their current state of mind or their current emotional state. So in the sense, we're trying to find ways of using all these different approaches in combination, seeing how they relate to one another, and if we have new original measures, finding ways of validating them so we make sure they have some robustness in what they're trying to measure. So that's one approach that we're taking. And the second question, I believe you asked about sort of measuring longer term outcomes, longer term changes. Yeah, that's something that's historically been a weakness of work, not just in psychology, but a lot of other fields. And so we're trying to find ways of, and this relates to the question of integrating measurement inside the game itself, inside the narrative experience itself. If we have these experiences that are meant to be sort of repeatable or replayable like a game, and there's some instrument or way of measuring effectiveness in the game itself, that could be one way of doing that. So if we had, say, a digital version of a game where it could track players who repeatedly play it, and if there's something about their choices in the game reflect some transformation, that's one way of measuring sustained change. If they come back to that experience and we see, say, an increasing level of change or sustained change in their choices, that could be one way of measuring it. A more traditional approach that we're using in some of our work now is simply to do follow-up research where we see if there's any long-term effect. So our current project I mentioned briefly at the end with self-efficacy in healthcare, we're actually measuring people's real-life healthcare interactions and experiences weeks or months later to see if the game planted any seed for increased self-efficacy that translates to actual changes in people's behaviors in their own life experiences. So we're trying to find these are great questions. We're still grappling with the best way of handling both of those questions, validating new measures, measuring long-term impact, but those are definitely things that are super important in the space of persuasive design, for sure. So I appreciate the questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was also really good questions we face here in our lab as well. When we come up with questions, how do we validate them and compare them to others?
Yeah, I think especially for those novel measurements, usually when you reveal that, it's kind of, you cannot follow up again, right? So because the user will already know that the response bias will be even larger because they don't want to be, tricked again, in a sense.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Luckily, there are some approaches. If like they're often more logistically difficult to implement that might get at some longer term effect. So one thing we've been experimenting with is using more of an experience sampling approach, where after an intervention, if we ask participants to sort of stay as part of the study, but respond to sort of randomly triggered sort of diary entries, for example, where they tell us about like what they're currently doing or thinking, telling us about a recent experience they had that day. That might be another way of getting at it. So if we're somewhat subtle in the way we word those questions, we're just getting at some general life experiences, we can then sort of hopefully start to use that data to see if there are measurable changes in things like behaviors or perceptions of certain contexts. So that's another approach that we're considering, for example, with this healthcare game that we're working on right now.
Thank you. Just a follow up. Do you think there will be an opportunity for physiological sensing to measure effects in this area, or in some fields, in some research here, we are using EEG, trying to understand emotions. Yeah. Would that be applicable in your kind of research, or?
I think it's absolutely highly applicable, especially in my work that touches on either unconscious biases or stereotypes. There's some early evidence that there are distinct patterns of physiological response, either when your own biases have been triggered or when you're the target of somebody else's biases. So there's a distinct physiological response to, for example, being the target of a microaggression, or conversely, exhibiting a microaggression. And so the next wave of research on bias, I think, almost has to include some way of measuring in real time when these occurrences are happening, as a way to to intervene before they can have some real psychological impact or damage. And so we've been exploring the use of physiological sensing as a potential sort of real-time intervention for these experiences. As one of several approaches. We also want to look at, for example, if we can detect through language whether microaggressions have been expressed, or through the analysis of nonverbal behaviors, whether microaggressions have occurred. But I think that's one space where I think it's really can be really impactful. The one danger there is it's hard to understand how to implement those types of interventions in ways that aren't perceived as a violation of privacy, or they're invasive, that don't trigger some level of defensiveness on the part of, if you're using physiological data to tell somebody that their own biases, unconscious biases, might have been triggered, that might have affected them in some way. How can you allow people to sort of accept that and confront that? And likewise, if you're using physiological measures to detect whether somebody's experienced a microaggression as the target, from that perspective, how can you deliver that information in ways that doesn't sort of exacerbate that? So that's sort of the area we're grappling with. So I think there's promise there, and that there is a distinct tie between physiological threat responses and unconscious bias, but how to design like an ethical and effective intervention that uses that information as the basis is the next key challenge in that space. So I think that's one area where physiological data can be really helpful. We've done a bit of work as well in understanding how physiological data can be used to express emotions, especially in times where you might not be comfortable verbalizing them. So we did some work a couple of years ago with romantic partners who were given physiological sensing technologies that they could use to then share their biosignals with each other, as opposed to verbalizing. And we found that there were certain contexts or reasons why people were more comfortable sharing their biosignals as opposed to, say, expressing frustration or disappointment with a partner. So we found that, interestingly, that sometimes people use physiological data as sort of an entry point to have difficult conversations that they didn't feel comfortable initiating, where they were able to use their data as a way to express negative emotions in ways that they didn't have to verbalize. So that's another interesting direction that we're hoping to consider, ways where you can use your physiological biosignals as a communication, a means of communicating emotional or cognitive experiences as a substitute for verbal communication.
Thank you. We have a question from Sayash.
Yeah, I was wondering about the idea of experience taking, like the pictures you showed, artwork. They were like, of course, they were, sketches and illustrations. What about like these days with the powerful game engine, one can create almost realistic looking human beings or characters? Is there any research or any findings on would people relate more or be more powerful to see a almost real looking person versus a like a cartoon image of it is both can be fictional, but where will somebody have more empathy or more experience in other person's shoes?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'm not familiar with a ton of work that's looked at that distinction between the level of realism of depiction and the level of empathy. I think it definitely relates to this question of how much psychological distancing is effective for increasing some empathy. The closest example I have from my own lab is we did a study where we had, it's not quite the same question you're asking, so I apologize in advance, but we had a study where we wanted to see what types of depictions people would choose for themselves to represent themselves in expressing personal experiences. So we had this the software where you could have an avatar to basically as a substitute for your video feed. It would capture your facial expressions and emotional expressions, but would use sort of a character as the skin. And so we had a whole set of these avatars that people could choose from, some of which were highly realistic, some of which were more fantastical, some were animals, some were inanimate objects. And we varied the types of experiences people were sharing. And we found some interesting things, at least in our first study, that people were more likely to pick a realistic avatar if they were sharing something positive and non-threatening about themselves. So if they're sharing, let's say, a success or a triumph they've had, they're more likely to use a realistic avatar. But they're more likely to pick a less realistic avatar, in particular, a less realistic avatar that imbued some quality they wish they had if they were reporting something that was either more negative or self-incriminating. So they were using that fictionalization distance from themselves to express that reality. So if they were sharing a case where they had a shortcoming or a failure or a rejection, for example, they're more likely to pick a non-human avatar for one, and a non-human avatar that had some apparent trait that they lacked in the experience they were sharing. So if they were relaying an experience where they were not courageous, for example, they're more likely to pick, say, an animal like a lion that depicted courage. So we didn't anticipate that. This is these interesting patterns of people that led people to pick different types of representations depending on the type of experience they were sharing, as well as sort of the dimensions they wish to embody in presenting that experience. And so that's not quite the question, not quite answering your question, but I think it's an interesting sort of domain of work that could look at these questions of dimensions or levels of realism and how they might affect people differently. I think that also relates back to the Proteus effect. I'd be curious to know how Proteus effect findings might differ based on the level of realism and the avatar's depiction. Like all really super, super juicy questions I'd be curious to know the answer to.
It's amazing that there are so many questions we need to answer in this field.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good. It's keeping us all in business.
That's great. Any other questions before we close the session? Certainly, I learned a lot from the way you are designing a user study and how you design the game to be subtle, and especially how we can encourage learning in a way that is not direct or that it's actually. I like the approach where you mentioned not a chocolate covered broccoli. So I'll try to keep this in mind for next user study and designing here. Thank you again, Geoff. It's been a pleasure hosting you here. We learned a lot and appreciate the time you did to prepare this presentation and talk with us. Thank you very much.
Yes, my pleasure. Please keep in touch. If anyone has any questions or wants to chat more about any of these topics, feel free to reach out at any point. Happy to schedule a time to meet and chat more.
Thanks again.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everyone. Have a great day.
You too.